When people talk about why they do things, they often use words like motivation and incentive. These are often quite self-serving terms, but sometimes we do things because we feel it is our moral duty. These are actions that do not directly benefit us, but land in the category of what we think is the right thing to do. But beyond that, there are things to which we feel duty-bound, that were thrust upon us by our ancestors. We do them because they are our inheritance. It felt like there was no familiar ground left for Edith, who walked down a lane on a crisp Thursday morning that she had trodden thousands of times before. The ridges, muddy potholes, and grassy banks that she knew so well felt alien and menacing, like an imposter had swapped them with a chillingly convincing double. Perhaps it was more the destination than the journey that was making her feel so ill at ease. The bundle of stuff in her arms was drawing her towards a place she had always been told not to go. Don't step a foot onto that estate. It was a regular warning given to her by her own mother when she and her siblings went out to play and explore the surrounding countryside as children. The taboo of entering the area was not just reserved for children. Even the local postman said he felt like the place was wrong. For one thing, he never once saw who collected the post from the delivery box. Yet, this was most certainly the address, and for the first time in her life, she turned left off the lane and made her way down through a tunnel of trees past the mouldy sign saying private property. For a minute, it seemed just like another country lane, but as she walked deeper into the estate, the lane became decorated with chipped stone statues on either side of the path, half buried in unkempt bushes. They were scarred, grey, and textured by moss growth. Angels, Greek-style sculptures, hideous gargoyles, characters from fairy tales, and abstract pieces with no discernible subject. There did seem to be a slight bias towards statues of chess pieces. Two stern-looking chess bishops looked down on Edith as she reached the first gate. She clutched the bundle in her arms close to her chest, as if the stone monuments were about to reach out and steal it from her. The gate must once have been grand, with rich, deep red paint and golden accents. Now it was more like a rusted spider's web, creaking wearily in the breeze. There seemed to be nothing and nobody nearby, other than a postbox, and there was no way to get anyone's attention. Edith chewed over what to do next, finally settling on putting the bundle in the postbox and hoping the correct person came upon it. But as often happens in those situations, with full expectation that it would not work, she gave the gate a push. And in one of those rare events where irrational actions pay off, the gate swung noisily backwards, leaving the way clear. Edith stood still for a moment, the air having suddenly become weighted with a heavy unknown. But she was having a queer response to the strangeness, in that her feet became emboldened and they carried her over the threshold and around a tree-flanked bend. The first thing she noticed was that the path had a long series of wire arches over the top of it, over which leaves, flowers, and vines had grown. Between each arch was a niche, and settled in them were statues of various ages and repairs. Some reflected light with a glossy sheen as if only carved in recent years, Others looked barely more than blunt lumps, as if the victim of millennia of weathering. Edith struggled to imagine how anyone could have assembled such a vast collection. After passing through the tree tunnel, she came upon a wall with a grand gate set in it. The wall was thick and round. It must have once been pearly white, but was now grey and beset with vines and weeds. The bricks appeared to be covered with plaster, arranged in a way that looked like the scales of a reptile. The long wall, disappearing into the trees in both directions, felt like a great serpent sleeping amid those secret English woods. An assembly of black crows were perched on the top of the gate, staring silently towards her, their heads tilted slightly left as if they were expecting something. Edith wrapped her jacket tighter around her, not sure whether it was the chill in the air or the strangeness of the place that was making her shiver. Still, something drove her feet onwards, and soon she was approaching the crow gate. About 3 paces from it, the crows took flight, squawking mockingly as they sailed over her head. As much as they had startled her, she immediately missed their calls, as they had punctured what she had just realized was a painful silence. She became overly aware of the blood pumping in her ears, and her lone footsteps felt thunderous under the silent gaze of a legion of statues. On she continued. Through the gate and onto the other side of the snake walls was what she first thought was some old graveyard. A wide grassy space, dotted with trees, and different coloured gravestones erupted regularly. After a few blinks, however, she made out that they were not, in fact, graves, but rather an ocean of statues of all colours, ages, materials, and subjects spread out among and within grass and bushes. They're a queer lot, the memory of her mother's voice regarding the owners of the estate whispered in her ear. She wondered whether she had known of this stone kingdom, hidden within a 5-minute walk of their home. Following a small, winding pathway, Edith moved through the stony land among its still citizens. Some of them were familiar. Greek-style sculptures. Others were foreign, like those that could be seen in museums in London, taken from distant places she could not fathom. But she began to notice commonalities between many of them. A favourite subject were tall, angel-like beings, often depicted holding chess pieces in their hands. Many of them, at their feet, had tiny people with peculiar, round, smooth heads and almond-shaped eyes, looking upwards at the angel with what she felt was a sickening adoration. At this point, she had come to a wide, circular open area where the crowds of statues finally parted. In the centre was a pool of water, which was a deep, unsettling red colour. She could see a stream babbling cheerfully out of its centre, but she felt like it was quieter than it had any business being. The path continued around the pool, and towards the most extraordinary, singular object she had ever laid eyes on. An enormous, monolithic circular table. One of its rough-cut basalt legs was the same height as herself, and a half again. Around the table were equally massive stone chairs, the seats of which her chin was just about tall enough to be level with. She strode curiously over to the nearest seat, which was empty. For a moment, she rested her chin on its cool surface. On the other chairs were the crumbled remains of statues. Some had only 1 foot left, which sat at the leg of the chair. Others had no heads. One remained mostly intact. It held its stone hands clasped in front of it, resting on the great table. Beardless, with a strong chin and deep, knowing eyes. The stone man was beautiful, but in a terrible way. She could not quite understand why, but she felt as if he were of the same breed as the German army. Hard, warlike, but of a whole different scale. Awful in his perfection. Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. She heard her mother's voice in her head as she pictured these giants rising and settling at their table beside their bloody pond. In those days, the Nephilim were upon the earth. A light-hearted English accent chimed from somewhere behind her. Thoroughly startled, she swung around and pressed herself up against a basalt table leg, nearly dropping her package. From Genesis, Papa would always say that when we came out here, he continued, now in full view. He was dressed in a smart tweed suit, had a very soft expression, and looked like the type who is always very close to smiling. I am sorry, I did not mean to intrude, Edith stuttered, trying to collect herself enough to hand over the package. Marvin Cole, he said, putting his hand out. Instinctually, she responded by putting hers into his, and he bent over and kissed it. Edith Miller, she gasped in response. I have something for you, she blurted out clumsily. I was going to leave it at your mailbox, but the gate was open, and I just... Her words faded into barely coherent mumbling, and she pushed the bundle in her arms towards him. Marvin took the bundle with polite curiosity, and smiling benignly to himself at his visitor's confusion, opened it. He froze as still as any one of the many statues. How did you come upon this? He asked quietly. I'm an army nurse. I was tending to your brother. Unfortunately, he passed. But before, he and I spoke, and he found that I lived close by to this address, and he asked that if he should die, I would bring his personal effects to his remaining family while I was on leave. So, here I am. Edith presumed the inscrutable expression on his face was grief and shock at the news of his brother's demise. But she could not help but feel that he was experiencing some other type of emotion. Did he die from his wounds? Marvin asked, tucking the package under his arm. No, the flu, as did most of his unit, Edith replied. I see, he said, his voice cracking softly like crinkling paper. The army will be in touch with the details at some point. If you excuse me, Edith said, intending to make her brisk way out of this strange otherworld. Wait, he called after her. She felt like a hook of hot metal caught in her stomach. Yes, she replied, looking back. How are you still alive? He asked. I beg your pardon? Edith responded, mildly annoyed and more than a little alarmed. You touched the empty chair. I saw you. He gestured to the empty stone throne behind her. It's just stone. It's not toxic, she said warily, wondering if he was playing some odd joke on her. Can I show you? He asked, an innocence and sincerity reflected in his voice that seemed to root her to the ground. If you jest with me, it shall be in very poor taste, Edith protested. No fear of that, Miss Miller. Just be patient with me for a few moments. Marvin quickly turned around and went rummaging behind some bushes. Edith peered after him, and he was digging around in a run-down tool shed. After some grunting and whispered swearing, he returned. In his arms was a box of bird feed. He walked over to the edge of the empty stone chair, and keeping himself at an exaggerated distance to avoid touching the stone, he raised his hand up and dropped a handful of bird feed onto the stone seat's surface. He then retreated to stand beside Edith. Now, we just wait a moment. Cigarette? He offered her politely. She declined, and he lit up, and then they quietly waited among the statues, looking at the great table and its ensemble of thrones in nearly perfect silence. Just as Edith's patience was beginning to wane, a robin alighted on the surface of the table, overlooking the chair. "Watch closely now," Marvin whispered, his voice unexpectedly grim. The robin skipped lightly along the edges of the table, its tiny eyes scanning its surroundings, estimating its chances of a breakfast free of cost and free from predators. Deciding the way was clear, with a flutter of its wings, it popped off the table and landed right next to the pile of birdseed. There came a moment that appeared to get somehow stuck. The passage of time had become clogged, and it was mired in some no man's land between seconds. The bird was frozen, one of its eyes firmly on its much anticipated feast. Like a boot being pulled out of deep, moist mud, the suction that was holding time at bay released, and a feeling like a million icy corpse fingers brushed over Edith's body as if her skin were naked to the air. She felt herself gasp as if she had just fallen into cold water, and then gasp again, this time at the shock of seeing the robin lying on its side, absolutely still, in death. Then she was frightened out of her wits for a third time as a gargling and bubbling sound came from her right. The red fountain's babbling center seemed to have received a boost, with the stream rising a few feet higher in the air and its colour becoming deeper. Then it settled down to how it was before. "What?" she gushed out, nearly biting her own tongue. She was no veterinarian, but she spent enough time as a nurse to realise that living things simply do not topple over dead in an instant without bullets or great blunt force impacts. Even failures of the heart take sometimes minutes to fully extinguish the flame of life. Life does not simply turn off as a result of precisely nothing. "Do you understand why I'm surprised you're still standing, Miss Miller?" he asked, his voice quiet and inscrutable. "In a manner of speaking," she replied, feeling a little shaky in her legs. But then she felt her fear and confusion be overcome with a sense of righteous anger. "Sir, if I am not mistaken," she said, her voice irate, "you saw me coming, and you knew what would happen should I touch that monstrous thing over there. And yet you let it happen. You were happy to stand there and let me die. There's nothing I could do about it. Why do you think we keep this place hidden?" "How do you mean?" she demanded, her voice accusatory. "This," he said, spreading his arms wide and gesturing to the table in the pond, "was here first, my father told me. Anyone could see it, and the empty seat seemed to have some power to call people towards it. Soon the body count became such that my ancestors built an estate around the land to keep it from taking any more innocent lives." "What is this rubbish?" she demanded. "I couldn't stop you even if I tried. The moment you looked at it, you'd have done anything to touch it." He looked at her with an apologetic sternness she associated with school teachers. Edith felt the shock of the last few moments fall into an emotional vortex. "All I wanted to do was return a dead man's belongings to his family, and instead I end up in this place where apparently I could have just died." Noting the tears coming at the corners of her eyes, Marvin couldn't help but feel for her. "There's nothing I can say or do to change these unhappy circumstances. The only thing I can offer is an explanation," he said in a conciliatory fashion. "It had better be quite some explanation, sir," she spat. "Walk with me?" he asked, offering his arm. Grabbing it with rather a painful grip, she gave her consent. The stubborn part of her would not let her walk away. She had already gone through enough that she would see whatever it was through to the end. "How does a stone chair just kill someone? Edith asked as the pair began to walk through the assembly of statues. If only I knew. We can see that it does, and not much else. We had forgotten how these things work. Are you saying you once knew how to kill with just a touch? Not I, but clearly someone did. There is so much we do not remember. Trying not to forget is my family's specialty. What on earth are you talking about? Stone is one of the longest lasting natural materials. What better medium is there to remember things? Are you saying all of these statues are memories? For sure. Many were sculpted by my ancestors, others were bought or discovered elsewhere. Each is more than just a piece of art. A few are even my handiwork, albeit I am not as skilled a craftsman as my brother was. He trailed off a little as his grip tightened around the package in his other hand. Looking to keep the subject away from his bereavement, she asked, "Can you explain how one of these statues is a memory?" "Of course," he said, and directed her into an open barn-like structure, which contained a number of statues, in various states of construction. "The workshop," he said. He led her through it and out the other side, into a little grove surrounded by hedges. "This is my personal favourite." The statue he stopped in front of was truly hideous. It was carved out of a shiny but hostile black granite that sparkled in the sunlight, but in a way that felt like it was flashing warning lights. It was obvious what the subject was, the Virgin Mary. However, her robes were slashed open, exposing her belly, and carved into it was the jagged, clumsy shape of some sort of dog or wild animal. Its roughness contrasted strongly with the expertly carved statue itself. The Virgin's face was also twisted in hatred. Her eyes were hostile, and her hands were clenched in fists. There was no sign of a swaddled baby Jesus anywhere on her person. "Goodness gracious," Edith explained, finding the presentation quite alarming. "Papa would say that this was sculpted about 300 years ago by an enterprising ancestor of ours who was exploring the Levant. Apparently there was a group out there who had a unique memory of the Mother of God." "What is wrong with her?" Edith asked, finding the form rather sacrilegious. "Papa would just laugh and say it would have been that time of the month. Mama would say she felt like it was the face of someone who was sick of the lies." The couple moved on through the grove, through a little gate, and into a long garden, which once would have been magnificent but, like everything else, had been left overgrown and wild. In the center of a dried-up garden pond was a statue of a tiny, bulbous, vaguely humanoid creature. Its head was round and elongated, and it had 4 fingers. It stretched its small arms upwards, as its chipped and mossy almond-shaped eyes stared emptily off into the distance. "Such a bizarre thing," Edith remarked. "We think my great-uncle Samuel discovered this one in Brazil. He and his wife, a noted eccentric even by our standards, had a hunger for these subjects. I think I saw a few on my way in," Edith said. "There were 43 of them on the estate upon my last count," he informed her. "What are they? And why would you go to such lengths to get them? It's not that they are even pleasant to look at," she asked. "This is something my family often discusses at the dinner table. We aren't sure. Great Uncle Samuel was greatly smitten with his wife. It was more her passion than his, and he seemed happy to go along, and not ask too much of her. A spineless man lets his wife keep secrets from him? Perhaps a sensible one. She was a Butterworth after all. Normal rules seem not to apply there. I have never heard of them. That is definitely for the better." The pair continued on their tour and climbed a rotten set of wooden stairs and onto a viewing platform. The platform overlooked the stone table and the red fountain. In the center of the platform was a brown marble statue of two men holding up a cross. "What does this one mean?" Edith asked. This one was commissioned in Paris just about 50 years ago by some obscure cult who had grown tired of their vanilla religion. They seemed to think the Lord Jesus was somehow two people with two bodies, and that he had two tombs. There's not much in the way of sanity there. Their memory of Christ is different than their countrymen's, Marvin said. But is any of this true? Edith asked. Truth isn't our business. It's memory. Forgive me, but I am starting to question whether today is merely a dream. Marvin chuckled. The problem with normality is that it's quite fragile. I must point out, as you can see it in full from here, the pride of generations of coal sculptors. Jormungandr. I beg your pardon? Do you see the walls that enclose the estate? Edith looked over the landscape and realized that her intuition that the outward walls had reptilian features was not mistaken. Surrounding the entire area was a stone snake. It concluded with a serpent head rearing up into the sky, its tail wrapped around its own neck, its Masonic forked tongue attempting to taste the clouds. How ghastly! I do hate snakes, Edith squirmed. Myths say that Jormungandr circled the world, and everything was inside its coils. But my ancestors thought it a fitting analogy. For someone claiming to be about preserving lost memories, you go to great lengths to keep people out. Preserving, yes. Spreading, no. Some things are only for the few. Does the king know? Edith said sarcastically. Kings are much too common for things like this. Then what does it take to be a member of your dismal museum? Something like laying hands on the deadly throne and walking away. You mean me? I shall hardly be returning. The moment I leave, I'll be drinking away the memory of all of this. I see enough horrifying things on the hospital ward. I can do without these stone memories of yours. But to the contrary, he said in a very flat and certain way. This will be your new life. The empty seat belongs to you. What are you saying? Edith asked, feeling unsettled. The seat did not kill you, which means the seat is meant for you. A new statue shall be carved in your image, and it shall sit on that throne. Edith guffawed at the absurdity of the suggestion. You want to sculpt me? Want? No. But I must. It is safe to say I shall refuse. You cannot. Are you threatening me? I am simply stating a fact. I'd like to go now, sir, Edith said, as she did not like where the conversation was going. To her surprise, he agreed and escorted her to the exit, and looked on as she walked down the tunnel of trees. Our first session shall be on the coming Friday at 4 o'clock. You assume too much, Edith responded, bristling at his unwanted certainty. Good day, Mr. Cole, she said, and made to turn, very finally, and walk away. But she noticed he had already left, whistling cheerfully as he went. He seemed more certain of her return than she felt about anything else. Ever. I'm not coming back, she called after him, but her voice simply faded into the greenery. The statues to her left and right were cold and unlistening. I swear to God, she finished, but said it so quietly and meekly that she could barely hear it herself. Then, she made her way back out the way she had originally come, but this time with the sense that, just below her level of hearing, the statues were quietly laughing at her.